Hi, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to discuss the different methods of using Kstars, Ekos, and Indi with the Raspberry Pi and how to connect them in the various different ways. Also, there will be a demo at the end of the video that shows the different methods of connections. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this. If you do, please like and subscribe, and let's continue onward. What is Kstars, Ekos, and Indi? Well, Kstars is an application that provides planetarium software with observational tools such as Observational Planner, Sky Calendar, Sky Charts, and other useful tools. Whereas Ekos provides Kstars with an application interface for guiding, focusing, and control of equipment. Ekos also provides the user interface to the Indi server. Indi provides the hardware drivers for Ekos, just like ASCOM does for Windows. It provides the interface software between Ekos and other hardware such as cameras, filter wheels, mounts, focusers, and other observatory accessories. Well, connecting Kstars, Ekos to Indi servers and drivers. In this diagram, I tried to show how the different modes of connections are made. In the top, where you see the desktop running Ekos, or in the top block, shows a desktop running Kstars, Ekos on an Indi remote session. In this mode, it's talking directly to the Indi drivers and then communicating to the equipment. Now the second block shows that the desktop is running an X server, and this is done by using SSH X forwarding. And in this connection, you're actually bringing up Kstars and Ekos as an application and talking directly to the Indi drivers on the Raspberry Pi and then communicating to the equipment. All of the applications are running on the Raspberry Pi 4. And the desktop is just getting the display information. And finally, in the desktop block below, shows a VNC session. And what that is doing is it's talking to the Raspberry Pi through a VNC session, which then you use the Raspberry Pi like a desktop. All of the VNC connection is doing is providing the screen frame and screen information. When using Indi remote server, in other words, the Kstars and Ekos is on the desktop and you're talking to the remote Indi server, the advantages are that the Kstars Ekos response times are much faster. That's because Kstars and Ekos is running locally on the desktop. It's fairly easy to configure, and it's perfect for observatory configurations. The disadvantages, however, you need an average speed for your network. Slow connection speeds may affect guiding, and I verified this. And transfer image download times depend on the connection speed. When using Kstars, Ekos, Indi locally on the Raspberry Pi using X forwarding, the advantages are that the desktop uses X server to communicate to the Raspberry Pi. It requires additional software on Windows to provide X server functionality. All processes are local to the Raspberry Pi 4. It uses minimal resources on your desktop, and there's minimal delay times for files and guiding. The disadvantages are you still need a good connection to maintain X server transfers. Kstars response times are slower due to being executed on the Raspberry Pi. And then finally, you need a greater storage available on the Raspberry Pi. I highly recommend that you use a solid-state drive and replace the SD card on your Raspberry Pi when running either X forwarding or VNC connections. Now, running Kstars, Ekos, Indi locally on the Raspberry Pi using VNC server, the advantages are you have the full access to your Raspberry Pi desktop. It uses VNC clients that support multiple devices, such as desktops, like Linux, Windows, Mac, Also, it supports phones and tablets. I wouldn't recommend using a phone. It's just a little bit more cumbersome, but tablet seems like a pretty good alternative. All processes are local to the Raspberry Pi. It uses minimal resources on desktops and devices, and there's minimal delay times between files and guiding. Now, the disadvantages, it requires a VNC client installation on your desktop or other devices. You still need a good connection to maintain the VNC connection frame rates. Kstars response times are still slower because it's being executed on the Raspberry Pi. And again, just like X forwarding, you need greater storage and faster storage access. Let's talk about network connections. Here's the preferred network connections in order. Hardwire via switch or crossover cable, a Wi-Fi 5 gigahertz connection, a 2.5 Wi-Fi connection, a hotspot connection using 5 gigahertz, a hotspot connection running at 2.4 gigahertz. Now, the difference between 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz, at the 5 gigahertz frequency, you have greater bandwidth and therefore you have faster transfer rates. The disadvantage of a 5 gigahertz connection is the penetration, or the distance that you could use that signal is far less than the 2.4 gigahertz signal. Now, running 2.4 gigahertz, it's a trade-off because you have less bandwidth, but you have further capability as far as the penetration or further distances to your equipment. And then hotspot is probably the least desirable. It's great if you're in a pinch. The disadvantages as far as using Raspberry Pi and hotspots is, I believe the distance is greatly reduced. You still have the issue of running either at 5 gigahertz or 2.4 gigahertz. And there's always some Wi-Fi devices that don't support the 5 gigahertz frequency. So the bottom line, the faster the connection, the better. So let's go on with the demo here. So without further ado, let's get started. Go over to the desktop here. And I've already set up, it's terrible out there. I almost didn't do this tonight because it was so bad, and I'm pretty sure it's pretty bad out there right now. So in this configuration, I'm running my system on a Linux desktop. And the way it's configured is, and I think the best way to demonstrate this is to show you. I'm going to pop out of here and disconnect and stop this and stop this. And I'm going to go ahead and close this out. So we're going to say we just brought this system back up, and we're going to bring up your Ekos tools. One of the things that dictates on how you set up your Raspberry Pi to talk to the Indi server is through the profile. And let's just bring up my profile here that I'm using. As you can see here, oh, interesting, it is actually on the Wi-Fi network, even though I'm connected. Let's change that. That's all I need to do to change it from my hardwire connection to my wireless. Anyway, you'll see here that we're connected to the remote and the Indi server. This is the Raspberry Pi, which we've talked about. And I'm using the Indi Web Manager to set up the drivers that Indi uses. And this is what it's going to be set up for. So I have an Ekos, I have an iOptron EQ45 Pro, an ASI 533, and a QHY, I forgot the model, 5 whatever, guide camera. So, and then I've defined, of course, the telescope and guide scope that I'm using. In this configuration, because I'm clicked remote, I'm going to be talking to the Indi server from my desktop from Ekos here. So I'm going to save this, and we'll go ahead and start the connection. Just like always, you know, I always check to make sure everything looks good and everything connected as it should. So now we are basically talking to the Indi server or the Raspberry Pi via the network connection, and this is what you see, and this is how you use it. It's going to be the same way as if you connected up to an X server, and we're going to do that next. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use X forwarding to connect up to the Indi server. Now, before we do that, you have to do a couple of things on the Indi server. Let me go ahead and disconnect out of here, stop here, and quit out of here. Okay, so now we're not, let me move this junk out of the way here. So now what we have here is just we know that the Raspberry Pi is out there and it's connected. I'm going to bring up a terminal window over here. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to connect to the Indi server through an X connection. And I'm going to do this for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to do an SSH minus uppercase X, and this is for X forwarding. And then I'm going to do the Indi server. So Ekos at Indi server, and hit a return. It'll prompt me for my password. And then once we've got the password, we're actually connected to the Indi server. So again, all I did was log into it using the minus uppercase X, and I'm going to start Kstars. So I'm going to start Kstars, and I'm going to put it in background. Actually, I'm not. Well, yeah, I will. The ampersand here puts it in background. So you'll see that Kstars is coming up right now. And you'll see also that the indication shows that, and I'm going to just block out this big thing so we can make it bigger. You'll see that it's running on the Indi server. So we are actually running Kstars locally on the Raspberry Pi, but it's connected to an SSH session displaying the display information. So let's go ahead and start Ekos. And it's going to be a little bit different. And I don't think I've set anything up. Oh, I actually have. We're going to go ahead and bring up the profile here. And I'm just going to double check the profile and show you a little bit. Now, it still shows that it's on the remote. We're going to turn that off because we're not going to be running it from the remote. We're going to be running it from the local side now. And again, we're going to select the various different different options that I have. And bear with me a second while I try and find the JMI here. Smart focuser, everything's good. And I'm going to save this. And this is we're actually running on the Raspberry Pi, and we're going to start the process just like we would from your desktop. And it's going to be bringing things up. And let's see. Here's the guide camera. Here's a smart focuser. Here is the 533, and then here's the mount. Now, you'll notice that it's probably a little laggy. The other important thing is, and I haven't gone over much detail with the mount and configuration of a mount, but you have to make sure that Kstars is configured correctly for your different geographical location. And if you're using a desktop and going into running the program locally on the Raspberry Pi, you have to set all that stuff up again. And it's not hard, but just be aware of that. You almost have to treat it like a fresh install. So here we are, we're running, you see the mount, and it's very similar interface. And what I mean by, I talked to you about how is laggy. Let me move this over here, and we should, you see how it kind of bumbles across here here's where we're at. You see how bumbly it is and how it slowly moves. It's not bad, but it's a little slower. And you may be wondering, what's this red here? This is my view of the sky. The red is either trees or my house blocking the northern half of the sky here. But as you can see here, you're basically running under Ekos. I'm going to go ahead and do a 10-second exposure here just to show you that it's running. The gain we'll set at 100, the offset at 10, and I'm just going to do a quick capture here. And again, you're going to have to make sure you set up the directory where you're going to store the files and so forth. Now, I pre-did this to make it a little bit easier. So here you go. And you can see the clouds have really come in and socked in. So that's Drake, one of the Dracos. I forgot what star it is, but it is working. And we're getting good download speeds of 0.7 seconds, which is very good. So you can see kind of it works not bad. It's pretty good running in this configuration. I wanted to do some other testing with guiding and seeing how guiding has changed between the remote desktop, remote Indi server connection, and a locally running program. Maybe I'll have something like that in the future. Let's go ahead and disconnect everything here and get to the final configuration where you're talking about VNC connections. Let me go over here and disconnect and stop. And we're to quit out of here. Okay. Now with VNC connections, you have to start the VNC server. And if you're using my distribution, I gave you a program called VNC Greeter Control. If you execute this command here, you could start and stop your X11 server. So we're going to start the server. We're going to say yes, we're going to start it. And we don't want to enable it on boot. Okay? And that's all there is to it. The X11 server is running. Now, I am going to go over here into... So let's go back over here. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the Indi server here. Now, you will ask you for a password. And give it the password you gave it during the build. And voila, there you go. You actually are seeing the desktop from the Raspberry Pi. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and log in. Okay, here we go. So here we're actually in the desktop of the Raspberry Pi. And you could see that it has the Kstars. If you use the distribution I have, the background's going to be a little different. But you'll see that it has PhD2 and Kstars, and you can configure it. If it's not there, it's under your application settings here, and you could go down and let's say you want to take this and put it in your favorites. You could right-click and select it and put it in your favorites. We're not going to do that, though. We are actually going to bring up Kstars by clicking on the icon and bringing up the software that way. Again, it comes up just like it would, just like you were running under X forwarding. You would start it just like you would. Your profile would be just like X forwarding, except for you're not using X forwarding, you're using the VNC server. So everything looks good. We're going to go ahead and connect. Validate everything looks good. You can see it takes a little bit of time. It should be just as fast as the X forwarding. maybe a little slower because you're dealing with the whole screen and not just the Kstars screens. So it's a little bit of different process. And I haven't done any benchmarks, so I don't know which is the best to use, but both are out there. Everything looks like it should. Let's go over here and just do a quick test to capture a 10-second exposure. And change the gain to 100, offset 10, and fire off a quick capture. And the download speed should be just as fast as with X11 or X forwarding. And it's a little bit faster, or slower, but that's still about the same. And you can see it's gotten even worse cloudiness out there. So after this video, I'm going to go put everything away. But I wanted to share this with you, and I wanted you to understand the difference between the methods of connecting to your Raspberry Pi, whether you're doing it through a local desktop and a remote connection to your Indi server, or whether you're running everything on the Raspberry Pi and just looking at the display information coming out. And of course, I haven't mentioned it, but theoretically, if you want to, you could have a display and a keyboard and a mouse out there with you, connected onto your Raspberry Pi and working it that way. But I think that's a lot of equipment, and if you're like me, especially in Minnesota where it's very cold right now, let's see. Right now, temperature is a -3 degrees. Well, ambient temperature looks like it's -2 degrees Celsius, so it's not too bad out there, but it gets quite cold, and my point is that I'd rather be in a nice warm basement than outside freezing my hands and everything else off. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments or questions, be sure to include it in the comments below. If you like this, please like and subscribe. Until next time, clear skies, and hopefully, and it doesn't look good, guys. It's really been lousy weather in Minnesota, and I expect us to be like this for a while. Typically in the wintertime, I might get 2 to 5 days of good viewing and imaging during a month in the winter months. So keep your fingers crossed. Who knows what this year is going to bring, just like every time else. It's a flip of the coin. Anyway, take care. Clear skies. If you like this, like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks.